I'm Kay Daigle of Beyond Ordinary Women Ministries. Welcome to this episode of our podcast, as well as it's on video if you prefer. And we are welcoming today Joy Skarka. She is the Authentic Intimacy Program Manager, and I will let her tell you a little bit more about that. But it sounds like she does a number of things. She works with their membership. She also oversees their online studies, creates content, and speaks to groups. So she's a multitasker, obviously, and uh, a busy mom and wife as well. So welcome, Joy. We're so glad that you're able to join us today.
Thank you, Kay. I'm so glad to be here. And gosh, I just have such a heart for leaders. So you are really creating content for those who need it. So excited to have this conversation.
Well, thank you. You can read more about Joy on our website at beyondordinarywomen.org. But Joy, tell us a little bit about authentic intimacy and what you do there and what the ministry does.
Yeah, I have been on the team since 2020, and we create all sorts of resources to help men and women understand God's design for sexuality. So that could be in singleness, in marriage, if someone's struggling with an addiction. Big picture, we want to help them understand what scripture says about sexuality. So we have a podcast, online groups, blogs, books, lots of things. We are busy, but just really helping people to understand God's design.
That's wonderful. I'm sure we could have many conversations with you. So I look forward to more after this one. Today, we're focusing a little bit on rape culture. And so let me just ask you what drew you to this subject, not just rape, but the whole area of sexuality.
Yeah, okay. So God really took my story, the pain that I went through, the brokenness, the addiction, and turned it into my passion to help other people. So, to kind of give you a short version of my testimony, when I was a freshman in college, I was raped. So, I am one of the women who have experienced this. And because I lacked a sex education, I was kind of unaware of all of what was going on, all of what had happened. And so that actually led me to Googling different things, which led to pornography. And so that kind of brought me through all these different areas of sexual brokenness and pain. And then through God, through his redemption, brought healing in my life. And then it turned into my passion. So now I talk about these things because so few people are talking about them. And I help women on their journeys of healing and restoration.
Uh, well, thank you for being willing to do that and being willing to talk about it so openly. Um, those events had to have been so difficult. And, and so that brings us to rape culture. But before we actually get to the rape culture, I thought we might need you to clarify some terminology because is there a difference in sexual assault and rape? Or are we talking about basically synonyms here?
Yeah, great question. And it is good that we talk about this first. So, rape is a type of sexual assault. So, think of it as sexual assault as the larger umbrella that you could put a variety of things underneath, like unwanted touch, kissing, groping, anything that you're forcing the victim. And then, rape is a specific type that includes penetration. So, that's kind of how you narrow in on that. And then when we talk about rape culture, that is kind of continuing these beliefs, attitudes, myths that normalize rape and sexual violence, especially kind of saying that the victim, it's their fault that they experience this unwanted sexual assault, rape. So it's kind of what we want to do, right, is help us to understand why this is happening, how to help that victim, and how to prevent it. So,
Right. Absolutely. That is what we need to do. So what does it really mean to have a rape culture?
Yes. So big picture that it kind of happens without you even realizing it. So it's in the subtle ways that comments are made about women in jokes, in myths is a word that's commonly used, and a rape myth are like widely believed almost lies that people believe. So let me just give you an example. So one rape myth would be that rape commonly happens in dark alleys, like with someone you don't know, when the truth is that 70% of rapes actually happen with someone the victim knows. So it's kind of way the culture, the news, the media has talked about these conversations in politics, that has created these myths that actually aren't true. And what happens is we're believing them, it actually hurts the victims because then women are afraid to come forward and tell somebody that they went through this experience because they don't think that they will be believed.
Mhm. And I know, I mean, I've heard for years that only a small percentage of women who are raped come forward. And so you're getting at some of those reasons. What are some other reasons?
Yeah, and even just I know the statistic on that. It's actually 3 out of 4 go undocumented, so unreported. So only 1 out of 4 women report. And honestly, like let's talk about it. There's so many reasons why you wouldn't want to report because just the way that the police have to go through it all, it takes years. The case it draws out, and then that really makes it hard for you to find healing from your trauma. So even one story that I'll share with you. So I had a friend, she was raped and she called me and said, "Hey, I want to go to the hospital because you're required, if you're going to report it, to get a rape kit." And so I went with her and it was a 2 hour long, she had just been raped. It was a 2 hour long kind of investigation of her body being touched all over by medical examinations to try and find some form of DNA. And she left there and she said to me, that was worse than actually the rape itself. That was more traumatic. And so these poor women, the extent that you have to go through to report it, it so those are some of the reasons. So fear, stigma, um, people not believing you, thinking, oh, I'm going to embarrass my family or I might lose my job. Like if it was at work with a coworker, there's a lot of fear around that. So there's a lot of reasons why people don't report it. And even just to share some of my story, as a college student, I could have reported it in two different ways. I could report it on my campus to my campus kind of police system, or I could have reported it to in the county police system. So I actually chose to only report it through my college, for a variety of the reasons that I shared. And even with that, I had to share my story in front of a board of, it was students, teachers, and staff. I think there were 5 people I had to share, and he sat right next to me. There was a small screen that divided us, and I had to share my whole story. And even that was traumatic. I mean, that took a lot of healing to work through. And but what that resulted was he was kicked out of the college. So nothing happened to him legally in terms of the county, but he was kicked out of the college. So that's just part of my story and how I went about it.
Yeah. And so this rape culture is part of the reason some of those things that are being said is part of the reason that we have so much rape in our country. So, can you go into more of the mindset that I think even Christians have? I mean, in fact, I've heard it. Christians have believed a lot of these myths. They have thought about rape and sexual assault without a lot of facts. They have blamed the victim, things like that. So, go into that
Mhm.
more specifically.
Yeah, so even sharing from personal experience, I remember one of the first times I told what had happened to someone, a loved one, their response was, "Well, why did you go to his dorm?" That was the first question I got. And so even the way that we respond to victims shows these underlying beliefs that we have, which is rape culture, that, oh, well, you chose to go to his dorm. Other common questions people would ask is, well, what were you wearing? As if, a mini skirt means that you were asking for it. Another thing people say is, well, were you drinking? I got that question before, as if, if you're drunk, that means that you just give consent and you were asking for it. So those are some of the common ones you hear. Um, and sadly, this has actually resulted in some women who maybe have larger breasts get breast reductions because they've heard people say, well, because of your body, you're just asking for it. Some women who have gone through sexual violence.
Mm.
So those are some of the things that victims hear, but a lot of the reasons why this is we're just allowing some of the common jokes, stereotypes, locker room talk. You might have heard that phrase, where we just allow it to be acceptable, where jokes and objectification of women, it just comes up, and it does come up in churches. It comes up in Christian culture. And one thing I talk about a lot, which I think is a lot of the root issue here, is pornography. So the average age of first exposure to porn is 7 to 11 years old. And so many, I think it's a high percentage, like 88% of porn scenes are aggressive against women. So if you have a young man or woman starting to watch porn at 7 to 11 years old, by the time they become an adult, they have a decade plus of years of seeing how they think women should be treated. And we know that pornography is rampant in the Christian church too. So that's something I bring up a lot, of a reason why this is just happening. And people think it's okay. It's become a normal thing. One example, I was reading this Christian leader, made this post and he said, because pastors keep falling, we keep hearing of Christian pastors, something happens to them where they've sexually acted out. He said, we need to be asking this question uh, with each other. And he said, when was the last time you watched porn? That was the question he posed. And when I saw that, I just kept thinking about it and thinking, is that really the way we should ask this question? Because we're assuming that, and he was talking about male pastors, we're assuming that all male pastors are watching porn on a regular basis. And I'm
Mhm.
thinking, like, just asking it that way, it's kind of making it okay. Like, we're assuming it's okay for all male pastors to watch porn. So I don't like the way these conversations are having. And then if we look at women, women are completely excluded from these conversations, which kind of perpetuates rape culture myths as well, because, women don't struggle with porn. They would never. Um, so
Right. Well, I know a few years ago, I had lunch with some friends, and several of them had watched a particular pastor preach to his congregation like the previous Sunday, and he talked about sexuality. I'm not sure exactly what his topic was, but they were commending him for the things that he had said, talking about basically that it was women's fault
mm,
that men would fall, that the way they're dressing, the way that they're coming on. He even quoted another pastor who was very well known and had many books to sell, who said that when he is at a book signing, or maybe he's speaking somewhere at another church, maybe he's in a different type of arena. I'm not sure exactly, but wherever he would go, that he'd be signing books. when women would come to the table, he would just be rude to them because women were known to come on to him. And so
Wow.
my friends were saying what a great sermon this was. And I said, I don't think I agree with you at all about this sermon. I said, and they said, oh, yeah, if you'd heard it, you would agree with us. And I said, okay. So I went home and watched it, and it was worse than I expected. What he was planting in the minds of everyone there was that women were Jezebels
Mhm.
and men were just, they just couldn't help themselves.
Right.
What do we do with those kinds of conversations? I mean, how do we, I mean, I did the best I could, and I did respond to all of them later and say that I'm sorry, but I still believe that he should not have said this. I said the pastor who was rude to women, there's no reason to be rude to people. I don't care what's going on. You don't just decide that a whole half of the world you're going to
Hmm.
be rude to because you can't handle, you know, a woman having a conversation with you. I don't know.
Right.
Anyway, I want
Yeah.
to hear
Oh,
what you have to say about this.
I know, Kay. And sadly, I hear this similar story all the time from women. And when they think of a woman sitting in a church hearing that sermon, she just feels horrible, right? Like, oh, it's my fault that this guy has a sexual sin struggle. But I think it says more about the pastor than it does the woman. But what you did, Kay, speaking up, that's the first step. That's what I suggest as the first step for people in who are hearing things like that. And maybe you don't know what to say. Speaking up is still the first step in saying, that just doesn't sit right with me, or maybe we need to think more about this and circle back with your friends like you did and saying, circle back after you educate yourself, read some things, and then you can come back to them and say, okay, well, here's why maybe this wasn't the best. And one resource, I just want to do a resource plug here, is Dr. Sandra Glon's book, Vindicating the Vixens.
Yes.
I She does such a great job of, I think one of the big picture problems here is that we have grown up with a bad theology of women where we
Mhm.
have sexualized every woman in the Bible. And that's what that book, Vindicating the Vixens, does, is it says, hey, maybe we did something wrong here. Maybe we misrepresented all of these women. Um, like when you hear the story of Bathsheba, she shouldn't have been bathing on the roof. It's her fault that David saw her and took her and raped her and killed her husband. That just doesn't sit right, that message.
Well, and I've even heard men say, men in leadership say that she was deliberately trying to lure David by bathing on her rooftop. It wasn't just a bad idea. She was out there to get him.
Right. And this is the message that so many women are hearing. And so
Mhm.
if you are listening and thinking, that's what I heard, I don't know any different messages, that's why that book it helps educate you. And so that would be step two. So step one, speak up in that moment, say, hey, this just doesn't feel right. I don't know why. Two would be to educate yourself on, well, what does scripture actually say about these women? What does scripture actually say about men and women in relationship? Because it has a lot to say about how we are co-laborers, we are partners in this in ministry. Um, so those are two things I would do in that situation. If they're brave enough, I would encourage them to talk to the church. I know if it's a mega church, you're never going to get to talk to that pastor, sadly, but maybe there's someone else at the church you can talk to, maybe a woman's ministry leader, or your small group leader, somebody that maybe you can pray it works its way up the chain. But yeah, so those are some of my first thoughts. And then if you're someone on that church staff who does have influence, you have a lot of power to kind of start changing some of these conversations where you can continue to raise up women leaders small group leaders, women in your ministry, and teach them, educate them, do a small group book study with them, so that you're kind of helping educate your community of women on this topic.
Hmm. Yeah, those are great ideas. I think those are really helpful. And so, would you say that this rape culture is part of the reason that churches are mishandling the accusations of sexual abuse that arise out of their own church?
Yes, I mean, I think there's a lot of layers to this, obviously, and every situation is so different, but a lot of it comes down to the teaching that we grew up with, the theology of women, and that is impacting rape culture and continuing it in our churches. There's so many examples of this happening. Another great resource I love is We Too, a book by Mary DeMuth, and that's all about sexual abuse in the church and just goes further into it. She has done a great job talking about this.
We had Mary on, um, and she mentioned that just a little bit, not a whole lot.
Mhm.
It wasn't totally about that, but I've read the book, and it's. I totally agree with you about both of these books. I think they would be really helpful to anyone. What what can a woman, perhaps she is a small group leader, perhaps she is the minister to women, perhaps she is a minister in the church, not necessarily over women, but how can they try to move the church forward as not being the main person, but being somebody in the church? How can they make a difference? What should we encourage them to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one idea I encourage church leaders of all levels is to create almost like a resource document, a PDF, something you can send to someone who is asking these questions, either someone who went through this experience or someone who wants to help prevent the experience. So resources like local counselors, you can recommend books, blogs, podcasts, anything to help someone and to educate them. And then, even more practically, I would come up with a game plan because we know that abuse is happening in churches. It's not a matter of if it's happening, but when it's going to come out, sadly. So I would come up with a game plan of what to do of when that comes out. When it comes out, what can you do? And so that could be like, who can that victim turn to? What are some first steps for them? Who are people in their church that are safe people? Maybe it's that leader, maybe it's other volunteers, a pastor, a care ministry leader, whoever that person is, list their names, their contact information. And then some more practical questions of like, well, when do we need to involve authorities? When does there need to be an investigation? When do the elders need to be involved? Who will advocate for her? Who's going to report it if it's a crime? So, just big picture, the church has to have a game plan. And so many churches don't have one. I think they're afraid to kind of they open that box because they don't want it to happen, right? But sadly, we live in a world where this is happening quite frequently.
Yes, it is. Well, what about just a one-on-one? What if a woman comes to you and says she's raped? How would you encourage women to respond?
Yes, I love this question. And so even thinking back to me and my story, how I would have wanted someone to respond to me, I think the first thing to do is to thank them. Like, wow, that was probably really hard for you to share, a lot of shame around it. Thank you for sharing that with me. I wouldn't ask questions about details. You don't need to know. You don't need to know what happened, how it happened, where it happened. Now, if that person wants to talk about it and wants to tell some of the details to process it, that's a different story, but you don't need to kind of dig for those details. So I would respond in love by saying, I'm sorry, and then asking, how can I help you? And they might not have an answer to that. That's where you can kind of provide some resources, provide some next steps. Hey, can I help you find a counselor? Hey, can I help you kind of process through this trauma? I would also just encourage you to believe the victim. This is something that the news kind of doesn't want us to do. But statistically, like a high 90% of sexual assaults are actually true. So that's a lot, 90 some percent. But just think about it. Why all of the trauma, the stigma of coming forward and saying that this happened to you? Why would you want to make that up? I know in my story, I mean, I would rather have not gone through that situation than tell someone about it. And then lastly, just learning the laws. Every state has different laws. So I'm not going to give a generalization here, but every state has different laws of when you need to report it. I definitely would say if it's a minor, I mean, if someone comes to you, they're a minor, you legally have to report it no matter what state you're in. But if they're an adult, things are different. So make sure you know the laws of your state.
And I was just thinking, we women aren't privy to those locker room conversations because they tend to be all about men talking to one another and making light of women and sexuality and rape, making light of those kinds of things. What can women do? Um, what can they do about that?
So I'm going to talk to the moms right now and the people who are in ministry who are discipling men. We have a lot of young men, right? We are raising up the next generation of young men. And so we can teach them how to respect women. We can stop using the phrase, oh, boys will be boys. That's a common one. That's a perfect example of a gender stereotype that we're teaching, even in Christian ministry, when we here's to youth pastors. This is a message to you in youth ministries. We need to stop dividing up the boys and the girls and giving the boys the porn talk and the girls the modesty talk. What that is doing is continuing rape culture because we are saying only boys struggle with porn and girls, hey, cover up. Instead, you can still divide both sexes, but give them both the porn and modesty talk because we have a lot of young women who are watching porn. So that's something youth pastors can do, moms. Another parenting thing is I would seriously consider delaying giving your kids cell phones because of the impact of pornography and the violence that they are watching. This is a conversation I have with parents all the time. They're like, well, my kid, all their friends have one. Well, do you want your kid to be exposed to that violence at such a young age? So, us parents can do a lot too. And even in the way that we model our relationships with men, with our husbands, and other friends in our life. Friends, I know in my small group, I have found such healing where I'm in a married couples small group. So, men and women couples. I have found so much healing in the male friendships I have with the other couples in the group. That has brought so much healing to my life because I grew up with the purity culture narrative where you have to keep your male's arms away distance or else you're going to make them stumble. So your kids will see that. I'm praying that my kids will see that I can have those guys' friendships and it's not a sexual relationship.
Yeah. Well, those are some really great practical ideas for us, Joy. I appreciate your sharing those with us. Is there anything else that you want to share before we close this podcast?
Yeah, I think I would just share that this is more common than you think. I mean, people might think, oh, well, this doesn't apply to me. Sexual assault and violence is happening to so many people, and the women that we're doing ministry with at Authentic Intimacy, so many people are hurting in their marriages, who are hurting have this in their past, and it impacts their current marriage, even if this happened years and years ago. And so this is such an important topic for women now, and it's going to impact their future relationships. So that's why if you are a woman in leadership, in ministry, serving, this is something that you should be concerned about. So I'm glad we're having this conversation, Kay.
I am too. Thank you so much for joining us. And we invite all of you out there in our audience to look at our website. We have some other conversations on this topic generally, and as well as many other things that may help you in your ministry, in your life, with the people whom you influence. You might have many opportunities to use these practical ideas that Joy has shared with us. You just never really know. So I would encourage you to also look. Joy, can you give me a list of some resources that we might recommend to them? And I will have that on our website. They can find it there.
Yes, that's perfect. And one more that just jumps to mind right now is sanctified sexuality. I wrote a chapter in that book on rape culture where we go more in depth of all the things we just talked about. So it's called Sanctified Sexuality, and I'll get a list of all these resources to you all.
That'll be great. So, if you're out there and you're wanting to look at some of these resources, I would encourage you to go to beyondordinarywomen.org and go to the menu at the top on resources and go down to the extras that we have, download extras, I believe it's called. I would encourage you to go there and you can download these suggested resources that Joy's going to give us so that you can do your own um, digging. You can educate yourself and be better prepared to deal with
Mm.
this world that we live in right now. Thank you again, Joy.
Thank you.
We'll see you all next time.